So last week I spoke about the crisis in Ukraine, and what I suggested then and what I suggested in the note yesterday is that the dominant power in this, or the dominant power on our side in this in NATO, is not the United States but Germany, because Germany is the major country in the European Union. And how Vladimir Putin sees himself is standing in the way of the eastern expanse of the European Union. Because as the European Union has advanced to the east, country by country, NATO has advanced to the east, country by country. And in 2019, the Ukraine entered into its constitution that it would be articles which make it possible for it to join the European Union and in turn join NATO, and I believe that that is what has provoked this reaction from Putin. I noted in the piece yesterday and also last week that back in July last year, Putin had opened up his strategy of dealing with this by publishing a major article about the long-term historical relationship between the Ukraine and Russia. Matter of fact, the Empire of the Rus back in the 800s AD was founded in around about Kiev, and it was only in the 15th century that it migrated across to Moscow as being the capital. So there is a long historical link between the two areas. I thought last week that there was a note of optimism because I thought there was a very positive reaction to the visit of Olaf Scholz, the German Chancellor, to Moscow. And those were public statements. There were public statements about troops being withdrawn, and the market reacted a little bit positively to that. But that has been replaced this week by direct activity. It's wonderfully ironic that Vladimir Putin, president of Russia, after recognising two provinces in eastern Ukraine as independent, he then reasserts their independence by invading them with his troops. And occupying them with his troops. Now, this provides a deliberate provocation to the Ukrainian army. The Ukrainian army is actually quite large. It's got about 140,000 people in it, not as well armed as the Russians. And there are some hundreds of thousands of perhaps as many as 900,000 potential reservists who could be called up. The major obstacle or the major strategic barrier in the country is 2/3 away. Across the Ukraine is a river called the Dnieper, which was the site of enormous tank battles in World War II. The Germans, some of the largest tank battles in history were fought in the process of crossing that river both from west to east and then from east to west. Should the Ukrainian army decide to fight a war to challenge what the Russians have done straight up, they'd be immediately surrounded by forces coming up from the Ukraine and down from White Russia or Belarus. And the war would be over in 10 days. So it's obvious that the Ukrainians are not going to take that as a provocation. Interesting, Putin has suggested that any action by the Ukrainians to defend their own country will be taken as a provocation, direct provocation, deliberate provocation to Russia. But last week I was talking about the potential economic things that the Germans could do within the European Union. Everybody talks about gas. and everybody talks about the German use of gas and importing it through Nord Stream 2. And as we know, Nord Stream 2 has been officially closed, will not be commissioned. We've been told that by Chancellor Schulze. But the problem is that it's not Germany that's really dependent upon Russian gas. It's Italy that's dependent upon Russian gas for 90% of its gas supplies. And Italy does not want to lose those gas supplies. And so the compromise that Schulze is offering is he'll halt imports of Russian gas through Nord Stream 2, or stop them from happening through Nord Stream 2, but continue to allow them to be imported into Italy because the pipelines go through the Ukraine. And that means that if Russia wants to continue to export any gas to the West, it can't destroy or attack the infrastructure in the Ukraine, which is a kind of a way of militarily defending something without having to have your troops sit on it. The other problem about the discussion of replacing Russian gas to Europe with gas from, for example, the United States or from the Middle East, the discussion has all been based on exporting LNG to Europe. But the problem is there are no major terminals in Europe yet constructed to accept that kind of volume of imports. And so Europe has very much got itself into a situation where it's in both the Russian interest and the European interest to allow the gas to continue to flow to the West. And again, there's been discussion of SWIFT, banning Russia from the foreign exchange system, SWIFT. But the problem about this is that there are substantial loans by Austrian, French, and Dutch banks to Russia. And if Russia was thrown out of SWIFT, then what would happen is these loans would default, and that could generate another euro area currency crisis. So the problem is the attempt to build a peaceful relationship with Russia from the European Union. It would be very difficult to unwind it rapidly in ways to generate devastating sanctions, economic sanctions, either in terms of gas or either in terms of banking. So that's why you've got these very targeted things being done by the British and will also be done by the Europeans. But we don't really know militarily how this is going to unwind itself or proceed over coming weeks, except that, of course, it generates enormously tough sentiment in equity markets. The other thing at the same time, which is generating tough sentiment in equity markets, is, of course, the prospective tightening by the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve next meets on the 15th and 16th of March US time, but it concludes its meeting on St. Patrick's Day, the 17th of March in Australia time. And conventionally, as the Fed moves to tighten the first time, equity markets tend to be weak going into that event and perhaps for a little bit period after. So I think we're not going to get very much relief in equities markets until the second half of March, until the Fed has met. Of course, any aggressive tightening that the Fed was thinking of will be mitigated by the international crisis provoked by Russia. So the only good side of the Russian-Ukraine crisis is that the Fed is likely to soften any actions that it might otherwise have made, and that should support the market after the Fed meets in March. So some people suggested that my commentary last week and the piece that I wrote were quite dark. I'm sorry, I have no further light to shed upon you until after the Fed meets and concludes its meeting on the 17th of March, except that the market is selling off into what we think is undervalued territory, but we don't really think it's going to bounce until at least another few weeks have passed. That's the end of my comment. Are there any questions?